For years, Russia believed Crimea was secure. Not just secure, untouchable. After annexing Crimea in 2014, Moscow turned it into a fortress. Air defenses, naval bases, radar systems, ports, supply depots, everything was built around one assumption: Ukraine would never be able to seriously threaten it. Crimea wasn't just territory, it was a logistics empire. Fuel flowed through it, ammunition passed through it, grain, oil, and exports moved from it. It was Russia's southern anchor in the war. But that assumption is now collapsing, quietly, methodically, strategically. Ukraine isn't trying to retake Crimea with tanks rolling across the border. Instead, it's doing something far more dangerous for Russia. It's making Crimea unusable. And that's where the port lines come in. Ports aren't just places where ships dock, they're complex systems: pipelines, cranes, storage tanks, rail links, power supplies, navigation systems, repair yards. If even a few of these fail, the entire operation slows down or stops. Ukraine understands this perfectly. Rather than chasing headlines with massive naval battles, Ukraine has focused on precision strikes, targeted attacks on port infrastructure, logistics hubs, and transport corridors connected to Crimea, sometimes with drones, sometimes with missiles, sometimes with cyber and intelligence operations that never make the news. Each strike might look small on its own, but together they're reshaping the battlefield. Now let's talk about something most headlines barely explain: the shadow fleet. Under Western sanctions, Russia can't freely sell oil or transport goods the way it used to, so it relies on a shadow network: aging tankers, shell companies, fake flags, weak insurance, and legal gray zones. These ships move Russian oil and cargo while trying to stay below the radar. And many of those ships depend on Crimean ports. That's the key vulnerability. Shadow fleets only work when ports are predictable, when insurance can be quietly arranged, when crews feel safe, when schedules hold. The moment uncertainty enters the system, expenses explode. And Ukraine is injecting uncertainty directly into Crimea. Every drone strike, every damaged port line, every disrupted pipeline sends a message to insurers, shipping companies, and crews. This route is risky, and in global trade, risk equals money. Insurance premiums rise, crews demand higher pay, routes get longer, delays increase, contracts collapse. Suddenly, a workaround that once saved Russia billions starts bleeding money. This is economic warfare disguised as military action. Ukraine doesn't need to sink every ship. It doesn't need to blockade Crimea completely. It only needs to make the system unreliable. And that's exactly what's happening. Now here's where Crimea turns from an asset into a problem. Russia has to defend it. Every port under threat requires air defenses. Every shipment requires escorts. Every strike forces investigations, repairs, and redeployment of resources. Naval ships that once projected power into the Black Sea are now stuck guarding infrastructure. That's a massive shift. Instead of using Crimea to dominate the region, Russia is now using resources just to hold it together. And this creates another problem: opportunity cost. Every missile system protecting Crimea is a missile system not protecting Russian forces on the front lines. Every ship guarding ports is a ship not threatening Ukraine's coast. Every engineer repairing infrastructure is one less focused on expansion. Ukraine is forcing Russia into a defensive posture without ever launching a full-scale assault. There's also a psychological impact that shouldn't be underestimated. For nearly a decade, Russia told its population that Crimea was permanently Russian and completely safe, a symbol of strength, a victory that could never be reversed. Every successful strike cracks that narrative.
It tells Russians and the world that occupied territory is not secure, that no amount of propaganda can protect infrastructure from modern precision warfare. And psychologically, that matters. Now, zoom out even further. What Ukraine is doing in Crimea isn't just about this war. It's a case study in modern conflict. This is how smaller powers challenge larger ones today, not through brute force, but through systems disruption. Not by capturing land, but by breaking logistics. Not by fighting everywhere, but by forcing the enemy to defend everything. This model is being studied closely in Washington, Beijing, Tehran, and beyond, because the lesson is clear. Naval dominance doesn't guarantee economic security. Air defenses don't guarantee logistical stability, and territory isn't valuable if it can't function. This has major implications for the United States and NATO. Ukraine is demonstrating that economic choke points, ports, shipping lanes, and infrastructure are as important as tanks and troops. That sanctions alone aren't enough, but sanctions combined with targeted disruption can be devastating. It also changes how future wars may be fought. Instead of massive invasions, we may see more conflicts focused on trade routes, energy hubs, ports, and supply chains. Wars where the goal isn't conquest, it's exhaustion. Now let's talk about escalation, because that's the obvious concern. Does escalating Crimea risk widening the war? Yes, but here's the calculation Ukraine is making. Russia already treats Crimea as Russian territory. From Ukraine's perspective, it's occupied land. Any military target there is fair game. And strategically, Ukraine believes that controlled pressure is safer than allowing Russia to operate freely. So far, Russia's response has been defensive, not escalatory. That tells us something important. Moscow understands that escalation carries risks it may not want to take, especially when the economic costs are already mounting. This brings us back to the shadow fleet again. As Crimea becomes more dangerous, Russia will be forced to reroute, hide more aggressively, or reduce volume. None of those options are cheap, none are efficient, and all of them weaken Russia's ability to fund the war long term. Wars aren't won only on the battlefield. They're won in budgets, supply chains, morale, and sustainability. And that's where Ukraine is scoring points. So when headlines say Ukraine blows up main port lines, the real story isn't destruction. The real story is pressure. Pressure on Russia's economy, pressure on its military planning, pressure on its narrative, pressure on its ability to sustain a long war. Crimea was meant to be Russia's strongest card. Instead, it's becoming one of its most expensive liabilities. And the shadow ships, once a clever solution, are now shadows for a reason. Vulnerable, exposed, and constantly under threat. This is what modern warfare looks like. Quiet, strategic, relentless. Not about who conquers more land, but about who can keep their systems running longer. And right now, Ukraine is attacking the system. That's why Crimea has become the biggest trouble spot for Russia's shadow fleet. And that's why this story matters far beyond the Black Sea. This is Gao Analysis. Think deeper than the headlines.